Hello and welcome back, everyone. This video is about another book by Byung-Chul Han titled Topology of Violence. And this book was translated into English by Amanda DeMarco. So thanks to Amanda and thanks to MIT Press for publishing this book in 2018. The basic task of this book is to describe violence, to describe the transformations of violence in across time and in different societies, in contemporary society more specifically, compared with pre-modern social structures and even in the earlier modern industrial societies. How violence has turned from its previous forms. It used to be external, visible, happening between self and other, within oppositional relationships, into now internal, psychological, invisible. It's an invisible, relatively less visible phenomenon. And it happens within ego's relationship to itself. It has a self-referential form. And it's in the service of economic growth within our current neoliberal order. So it corresponds to the form society is taking, the form of violence. The violence and society, those two forms correspond to each other, and there's a telos to how violence functions in our society, in our time. The reason why this book would be very difficult to summarize is because there are many different threads in it. There is a historical thread. There is a thread about the sociology of religion. There is a thread about psychoanalysis and Freud more specifically. There's a thread about the self-other relationship and the expulsion of the other. There's a thread about the distinction between violence and power, how those should be distinguished, how power is, especially when it is not violence, power is relational, how power is it can be constructive, and how it can maintain relationships, spaces, hierarchies. Violence, by contrast, is not essentially relational, and it is destructive. More on that topic in my future video about what is power. There are also in this book many dialogue partners for Byung-Chul Han, people that he is engaging with. He's reading their texts and thinking through their work and sometimes criticizing their works and sometimes relying on their works. And most notably for me, the dialogue partners in this book, Topology of Violence, where Alan Ehrenberg's book, specifically The Wariness of the Self, which is about depression, history of depression, was cited quite extensively and critiqued. There is Giorgio Agamben and several works by him, Homo Sacer, Means Without End, State of Exception, and the two authors, Hart and Negri, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. The two works that I recall being discussed in this book were Empire and Multitude. And Jean Baudrillard, the last person I will mention. The list goes on, but Baudrillard and his idea that singularities, the singular mode of being, opposes and resists the terror of the global. But depending on your interest, I think you would pick on and you will pay attention to different threads in the book and different people that Han is engaging with. I will do my best. I did my best, as you will see. I've done my best to make my discussion of the book coherent, to not make it seem like I'm jumping too much from topic to topic. But if you try to summarize the book, it will seem that way. It will look like there's so much going on in the book. And sometimes Han is making claims in this book that you might be a little bit skeptical about, and you might have to check some of his statements, like his claims about the status of friendship in Aristotelian politics, not ethics, but politics, how friendship might be for Aristotle, the core of his politics. I'm not an Aristotle scholar, but I was a little bit skeptical about that claim. There's also one other point in the book where he says that dictators in ancient Rome, when they rose to power, they did things to translate their violence into power. They held elections and took votes on various legal issues. And he makes a claim like that in the first half of the book. And my instinct is to go and check if you want to be sure about everything that he's especially his historical claims, his claims about the state of society in the past. I think some fact checking would be necessary. Anyways, let's read. So some passages about the psychologization of violence, how violence has turned from being something, a phenomenon, or a set of phenomena outside of the psyche to a phenomenon inside the psyche. So we read, violence is increasingly internalized, psychologized, and thus rendered invisible. More and more, it rids itself of the negativity of the other or the enemy, becoming self-referential. External violence unburdens the psyche. He's not saying that external violence is good when a person is violent to other people. But he's saying that that form of violence is easier on the psyche. External violence unburdens the psyche because it externalizes suffering. The psyche doesn't antagonize itself with endless internal discussion. So the advantage of externalizing violence, presumably, Han says, in societies in the past, led to people staging violence, having ceremonial relationships with violence, including but not limited to religious sacrifices. So he writes, in archaic culture as well as in antiquity, and the staging of violence was an integral, even central component of societal communication. Violence did not conceal itself. It was visible and manifest. It had no shame. It was eloquent and signifying. It signified something. It expressed itself. It was not shameful. Rather than staging its magnificence, now violence conceals itself in shame. It continues to be wielded, but not publicly staged. It does not expressly draw attention to itself. It lacks all language and symbolism. And it makes sense. The more you read, the more you follow his arguments about the self-referentiality of violence. The violence is something that we do to ourselves. That a person in our contemporary culture, the entrepreneur of the self-exploiting subject with their projects. Of course, it shouldn't enter into language, the fact that they are exercising self-violence. It should not become symbolically expressed in thought. The very fact of violence should be invisible and repressed, which brings us to Freud. We read, Freud's psychoanalysis is possible only in repressive societies, such as the Society of Sovereignty or the Disciplinary Society, which base their organization on the negativity of prohibitions and commands. The late modern achievement subject, the achievement subject is a big theme in Han's work. The late modern achievement subject possesses a completely different psyche than the obedience subject to whom Freud's psychoanalysis refers. The work performed by the Freudian ego consists above all in fulfilling a duty. And then he makes a comparison to Kant. Let's move on. The modal verb that dominates the society of achievement isn't the Freudian should, but rather can. This societal shift entails restructuring within the psyche. We should take a step further than that. Okay, the modal verb is can. I can do this, I can do that. But that can very quickly translates to I must. If I can, therefore I must. That's why it becomes a force, a push. Let's continue. The dialectic of freedom entails the development of new constrictions. Freedom from the other becomes a narcissistic relationship to the self, which is responsible for many of the achievement subject's psychic disorders. Okay. There's implication on health physical bodily health of this kind of society. We read, faced with the atomization of society and the erosion of the social, because everybody develops a much stronger self-referential mode of being. So social, community, those aspects of life are eroded. They become much weaker. Faced with the atomization of society and the erosion of the social, all that is left is the body of the self, which must be kept healthy at all costs. Why? Elsewhere, we read that it's because everything that you have, everything that you are and you have, is a commodity. It's a capital, and it should be leveraged for production and productivity. So the body has to be prepared at all times to do work. The capitalist economy absolutizes survival. It is not concerned with the good life. It feeds on the illusion that more capital generates more life and more ability to live. Neighbors being a little bit loud. The mania for health arises where life has become bare, like a piece of currency and void of any narrative content. Bare life, void of narrative content. So we become healthy not for the perpetuation and continuation of a narrative. We become healthy just for the sake of that ready for work, bare life. In connection to narcissism, going back to narcissism and how that's not the same thing as love, self-love, we read, to love oneself is to position oneself expressly against the other. In the case of narcissists, on the other hand, the border with the other blurs entirely. Those who suffer from a narcissistic disorder sink into themselves, which means no stable conception of the self can form. Narcissism, of course, is connected with depression. In depression, all bonds break, even bonds with the self, real self-understanding and self-relationship, real self-love. So it makes sense to differentiate depression from melancholia. Melancholia is preceded by an experience of loss. Thus, it always exists in a relationship, namely in a negative relationship to the absent. Somebody breaks up with you, or you lose a family member to death or for whatever reason, and that loss results in melancholia or mourning. But depression is cut off from all relationships and bonds. The late modern self expends most of its libidinal energy on itself. What is left of the libido is spread thin across steadily increasing contacts and fleeting relationships. Burnout is the pathological consequence of voluntary self-exploitation. The imperative to personal expansion, transformation, and reinvention, which is the flip side of depression, presumes a wide array of products associated with identity. Contrary to Baudrillard's thesis, social antagonism is not developing between the global and the singular today. Contemporary society, which displays increasing erosion of the social, produces scattered, self-focused selves with weak connections to the we, existing under intensely competitive conditions. There are micro-entrepreneurs who can only have business relations, if any. Related to loneliness and isolation, and here Han is commenting on Hart and Negri. He writes, "It is not multitude, but solitude that typifies contemporary social composition. Isolation doesn't generate power. Hart and Negri fail to take this social development into account. Contrary to Hart and Negri's conclusion, today the communal is in a state of increasing decline. The decline of the communal makes collective action ever less likely. They overestimate the strength of the resistance against the capitalist neoliberal system." Agamben, he's also criticized. Agamben completely misses the topological shift of violence that is the basis for the shift from the society of sovereignty to the society of achievement. When he's discussing a homo sacer, which is a concept referring to a concept, no, not really, a concept referring to the margin of the social order, Han does something really interesting and very topological. He writes, homina sacri of a totalitarian society are at the outermost edge of a societal order. So the edge of society, the margin of society. Homina sacri, homo sacer, is a marginal figure. He or she or they are located in a non-place like a concentration camp. As the late modern homo sacer, the achievement subject is centrally located. Typical homo sacer now is the typical citizen. Centrally located, directed directly at the center of an order, social order. Labor camps, quote unquote labor camps, also are no longer located on the outskirts. Rather, every achievement subject carries the camp with it. The achievement subject is prisoner and warden at once. It cannot defend itself from the violence because it is committed by itself. The center becomes indistinguishable from a non-place, related to invisibility and the psychic nature of violence, how center of a social order becomes, its margin becomes the locus of a non-place, becomes non-place. I would end with this. The book is a little bit scattered. There are probably too many threads of thought, and not all of them are developed, not all of them are tied back into the basic task of the book. So it requires patience, but because of how much Han has already done in other works, I think it would be safe to skip this one if you are interested in reading a few of Han's works, some of his books. I would say a combination of Psychopolitics, Burnout Society, the Expulsion of the Other. If you read those, this might not give you as much return on your time, except for maybe the engagement with other thinkers like Agamben. That's it. Thank you very much for listening, and till next time.